So I'm a little ancient, and I'll do my best to get through the PowerPoint. The subtitle, Medical Moralities and the Tides of Politics, is actually the title of a grant application that I'll hear more about the end of this year and next year. But it really comes from the question that has always intrigued me about professional life, that historically most of professional life has been apolitical. It hasn't engaged directly in the political disputes of one society or another. And that has a lot to do with the ability of professionals to stand back and accept the world as it is and then apply their knowledge to helping people. And I'm thinking particularly about medicine. So I don't have any conflict of interest that I'm aware of. This is a picture that many of you have seen before, Luke Field's The Doctor, which was commissioned by a man whose name is now associated with the Tate Museum in England, in London. And it depicts a doctor overseeing, obviously, a very sick child. It exemplifies, in a quite stereotypical way, care. But it doesn't exemplify what I think is become much more an influential force in our understanding of modern medicine, and that is competence and progress. This is an illustration of attending to a child who appears to be on death's door. So we keep in mind that this depiction is a powerful way in which we come to understand the expectation about care. This is an illustration of something that I wrote about in my book. It's a picture, if you see the person walking off in the distance is supposed to be Osler, who was departing from Johns Hopkins University and delivered a valedictorial speech called The Fixed Period. Now, if you're a reader or even a television watcher, I guess at this point, of the novels of Anthony Trollope, what is so interesting about Osler's talk was that he made reference to Trollope's novel, The Fixed Period, in which a community, a society called Britannula, asks and requires people to go to a special building where they never come out of at the age of 60. And Osler's point was that he believed that a man who reached the age of 40 had done probably all that he was going to be very regarded as important about. And so by the age of 60, Trollope wrote, you would go to this special building and you would not return. This hit Baltimore and the New York Times. This was an illustration in the New York Times that Osler was actually condoning euthanasia. And he took great umbrage to that accusation. But nevertheless, it illustrated to me the fact that having such an opinion made his appearance and departure from Hopkins something that the public contested about. And the first book that I wrote, which was based on my doctoral dissertation, I studied doctors in a state in the United States. I guess I'm not supposed to reveal all those things directly. It was called Daleton, a community of obstetrician gynecologists. I was interested in the role that they played in family planning and abortion in particular. The book was called Abortion in the Private Practice of Medicine. It came out in 1986. And what I was interested in at the time was the way in which doctors negotiated requests. And I established that, in America at least, the availability of that particular service, family planning services, but abortion in particular, was confined to clinics, and that most doctors in the community that I interviewed them in referred patients to these clinics rather than to address the issue directly with their patients. And that interested me because it suggested that there was some resistance on the part of doctors to participate in that particular service. So when Osler basically was accused of advocating euthanasia, he entered into a much larger public realm. And my point in my first book was simply that doctors historically wanted to stay away from the most controversial public issues. They wanted to somehow be part of a community of professionals that addressed, in this case, in that profession, illness and helping people. So those are old men dancing as Osler is leaving, and they're coming out from underground. This is another characterization of the doctor, and in this American case, this is from a series of photos that appeared in the 1948 issue of Life magazine by a then well-known photographer, W.E. Gene Smith. And Dr. Ernest Ceriani, on his way to a house call in foul weather, depicts a kind of willingness to be responsible. And in this case, he was the only doctor in this region in Colorado, so he was called upon to do a lot of different things as a general practitioner. Here he is again. I thought it was arresting that he's carrying the patient himself, again depicting a kind of solo vocation that was very representative in the United States until about 1960. The American Medical Association gave an award of the General Practitioner of the Year up until that time. And what's interesting to me about this is that medicine as a profession began to change in a sociological sense. The solo practitioner started to disappear, particularly in specialties like OBGYN. And what was replaced were, in the communities that I studied, were group practices in which the calling out in the middle of the night was no longer the same because you always had, in a group practice, someone that helped to cover your patients. And most people are familiar today in the US with such group practices. So I started out wanting to kind of depict a way in which the imagery of being a doctor is now kind of considered romantic and no longer really feasible. Once in a while there's an article on what percentage of doctors make house calls. And I'm talking about the United States, so I mean to make no direct comparison to Canada because I don't know. And I hope you'll tell me a little more. So, what do sociologists have to say? This to me is the thing about sociology I don't like very much, which is that we have concepts that are what we call total jargon, right? But there's something to this. There are two things I want to say. I won't go through every one of these, but for instance, the second one, proletarianization. That's, of course, a term taken directly from Karl Marx, who introduced, along with his colleague Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto. You know that the first line of the Communist Manifesto is, "The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles." That's either the most profound sentence ever written or the most paranoid. And I think that proletarianization as a social process, though, has some empirical and objective reality, which is namely that in the United States, again, more doctors are employees than self-employed. A doctor friend of mine says that in another 10 years, there'll just be 5 corporations running medicine in the United States. So it's not exactly Medicare for all, but it's something in a distorted way related to it. And that gets me to corporatization. I was thinking directly of a sociologist who's at Princeton named Paul Starr. Maybe you're familiar with the book that was called The Social Transformation of American Medicine. And the subtitle of that book is what interests me a lot. It's The Rise of a Sovereign Profession and the Making of a Vast Industry. I don't think there's any argument in the United States, again, about the vast industry. But I have been thinking for years about what the term sovereign, a sovereign profession, means. And here, I think Starr was onto something. He was more interested in commodification and corporatization. And he was leaving out what really, for me, is the fundamental issue about the person of the physician who is in that system and part of the system that's changing in these ways. So what I want to emphasize today is that the system has always been a complicated phenomenon. And it will remain that way, I think, for forever. But the question that makes for sovereignty means that the person who is involved in this activity understands that they have to do what they do based on what their beliefs are and what their conscience dictates. And I think that these terms were taken in a way over the last 30 years as being highly critical of doctors and of medicine and of the profession, when in reality, they're all terms that represent a kind of resistance to this change, a resistance to this sovereignty that is now looked at as romanticized in the illustrations that I used at the beginning. So what are some of the factors in the decline in trust? Burnout is a very interesting term because I'll come back to the other. Burnout is a very interesting term because it represents not just a problem in the medical profession, it's a problem in modern society. And the way that a sociologist, I think, would argue about this comes out in this article by Schaufeli, where he suggests that there have been 2 branches of approaches to thinking about burnout. One is what he calls a practice-based approach, a burnout industry, which has workshops, training programs, counseling, psychotherapy, organizational consulting. It's a huge industry. But there's also academic assessment, empirical research, which he points out that in 2017 alone, there were 75,000 studies according to Google Scholar and 10,000 according to PsychoInfo. This to me is mind-boggling, but it suggests a problem, as I said, that's endemic to occupational life in particular in American society. But I heard it used in relation to medical practice here in Canada. So I want to go back to. So what I wanted to point out, this is an article that was actually published in 2002 with this illustration. And I wanted you to see that there are 5 people holding up the doctor, but the one in the middle is the most interesting to me, clergy. In the 1980s, when I first started teaching at Wellesley College, I got interested in the role of clergy in hospitals. And the Boston Medical Center at the time almost eliminated that service. It was brought back slowly. But today there's, I think, empirically speaking, there's an efflorescence of interest in the role that the clergy and spiritual guides can play in America in a very multicultural way, so that given the diversity of populations that occupy hospitals, both from the practitioner side as well as the patient side, spiritual counseling and the role of clergy in this has become a subject of great interest. A colleague of mine at Brandeis, Wendy Cadge, C-A-D-G-E, wrote a book called Paging God, which is an empirical study of the role that chaplains in more recent years have played in hospital and medical life. So now I go past. Oh, I did want to say that the decline in public trust had a great deal to do, according to Schaufelli, with the 1960s. Everybody blames everything on the 1960s. But it really, again, in a demographic sense, refers to the rise of the baby boom generation, the post-war generation that grew up in the 50s and revolted in the 60s. But it was a time when professional status was diminished and attacked. Many institutions underwent a greater skepticism about their motivations and interests. So the decline in professional authority at that time, that began at that time, which was documented in a variety of ways, surveys, opinion polls, and the like. I refer here to Richard Sennett, a sociologist, who formulated an idea that he called flexible capitalism. And what he meant by that was that the trust in institutions declined as a result of the transformation of those institutions by many factors, many social factors. But probably the most important social factor was the security that these institutions would endure in the form that they'd always been in. So with all the changes the sociologists were documenting about the commodification, corporatization, demedicalization, deprofessionalization, all of those forces made the institution less reliable in the public mind. The Vietnam War made the military institution less reliable, though that seems to have changed in America, at least in some interesting ways. But the point was that what we were, Senate was seeing was a greater uncertainty about role responsibility. How do I make choices? How do I fulfill obligations if the institutions that I'm a part of are making that difficult for me? And again, this interaction between the system and the person, to me at least, is a valuable way of thinking about the way that sociologists, despite their jargon, have illuminated something about these processes that needs to be better understood. Okay. So, again, I'm not going to go through all these reasons, but I wanted you to see this is from an argument about the end of what was called the golden age of medicine. And I've referred to that by some illustrations. I've suggested that what we see as a decline in trust has multifactorial explanations. And they include the role that the state has played. It's an interesting problem. And when I think about comparing the Canadian medical system to the American one, why has the American system not adapted to the way in which medical care is delivered and organized in other advanced societies around the world? I don't have an exact explanation. There's a lot of argument about it. But again, it's political argument that a vast number of doctors have opinions about, but they avoid participating, as it were, too loudly in it because they have other things to do. And that takes up the time that is necessary to transform the political reality that still exists in making it very difficult. We're in an election process right now where what is called Medicaid, Medicare for all, still sounds extreme to a lot of people because of their satisfaction overall with private insurance. And you can see that the dynamic is always about opinion polls and surveys that enable people to see what's happening. And there are a number of doctors in the American political system in Congress who don't seem to be able to make as wide a mark on the way that things should go, but who nevertheless are not practicing medicine anymore, but are engaged in politics. And I keep trying to emphasize this fact. How much time do you have in a day that you can effectively participate in transforming the system and still do what you need to do? So that leads me to the way I would ask you to consider thinking about the limits of a sociological approach. So I've been attending these meetings for at least 5 or 6 years. I'll have to look back. One year, we were informed about told about the Jerome Lejeune Foundation. And what intrigued me, I knew nothing about it. It never, I think I'd heard of Jerome Lejeune largely because of his mention in terms of genetic research. But I didn't know the backstory of his ostracism and the ways in which the foundation has pursued a way of thinking about the beginning of life in a way that I'm absolutely certain that most clinicians in America and certainly patients are not very well aware of. And so it became important to me to try to figure out how I could say more about what this foundation has been attempting to do. And you see, when you when you see the way in which the foundation defines itself, this is taken from their website. This concern about the elimination through prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome children is happening in the society's advanced economies, advanced nations that also provide some form of what in the United States now would be called Medicare for all. I'm not suggesting a causal connection between the two things, but there's definitely a cultural similarity. And how do we think about ways in which this foundation asks us and implores us really to think about what kinds of cultural change needs to be enacted so that Down syndrome babies aren't eliminated because no one wants to take care of them, or at least that sounds like the expectation. And I think that the answer to that question is an answer about the practice of persons, not about systems. There's a widening gap between what is legal and what has to be also thought of as a matter of conscience. And that's where, to me, I think the trust breaks down. When it becomes viewed as a matter of inconvenience to people, there has to be some way in which the cultural expectation that creates that view of inconvenience can be challenged. And what I've learned over the years of attending these meetings is that there are practices that can illustrate this powerfully. Babies who are brought into the world and everyone knows they're going to pass away, perhaps very quickly, perhaps in a couple of weeks, perhaps in a few months, but that rather than thinking of this all in terms of prenatal diagnosis and termination of pregnancy, finding a way to help parents deal with what can be for people an inevitable part of life. And I think, I know it's happened among some of your clinicians who attend these meetings. I've heard anecdotally that it's happening even in Boston. A different sensibility, a different way of thinking about how to address what I guess you were calling earlier destiny. So this is where I suggests that, the quote, "We must demonstrate that Down syndrome is not something to be afraid of, and that these babies can grow up to live full and wonderful lives." That has to be something that can be communicated in more effective ways. But you see the problem. If you're a doctor addressing this, you have enough time to address it in clinical reality, but how do we address it in a larger cultural sense? It's not going to be a political transformation. It's not going to be changing the law per se. It's going to be in an exemplification of individual and collective action. The same applies to the end of life. So I said here, when I wrote my first book, Abortion in the Private Practice of Medicine, I was immediately impressed with the idea that an action that's being performed, it's very important that it be named. And what's happened in the case of abortion, and I would argue euthanasia, is that the terminology changes sufficiently so that I say here, it's not a denial of death, but the denial of what is being done to cause death. That these actions, both at the beginning and ending of life, are actions that require increasing euphemism of one sort or another, medical assistance in dying being the latest. In some ways, trying to have it both ways, not implicate the person who's involved directly, a physician in the action, but at the same time condoning it. So this is for me, a way of representing the extremes. Here again, it's been in a way, a wonderful learning experience to understand the ways in which hospice has grown. And this takes me back to the first illustration, the Luke Fields painting, where caring was clearly being exemplified, but the progress of medical intervention was not necessarily as well developed. Here you have Jack Kevorkian, who I guess you could say is a kind of American original, largely because he capitalized on the idea that some people had made a decision that too much medicine, too much progress, too much intervention had come about. I served on a foundation grant 30 years ago when hospice was still being argued about whether it belonged in a hospital. It's before anybody really heard of palliative care. And what was interesting at the time was that the resistance to hospice had a great deal to do with the belief that you could cure anyone of anything. And that's a powerful belief, because we shouldn't be necessarily saying that we've reached a limit to our understanding of medical knowledge and medical intervention. But what about the patient? What about the person who, for instance, wants to stop treatment? These are the kinds of questions that have to be asked in every era, every period. And the doctor who was faced with these kinds of questions back 30 years ago was more inclined to say we still have more to do. There's still things we don't know. And maybe we've reached a crossroads where we have a better understanding of, we know better what we can't do. And maybe it's not even what we can't do yet. Maybe it's just what we can't do. And that, to me, again, Kevorkian, in a way, had an answer. It's up to you. You decide. So what are some of the explanations in particular about the end of life that have impressed me? Again, from a sociological standpoint. I still have a little time. Yeah. One is clearly what has come to be called the right of personal autonomy. But sociologically, the social class and the appeal of that right have to do with people who don't want to be a burden to others. That's their rationale. It has to do with a certain demoralization of living in a society where the expectation is that, as William Osler found out in 1905, that if you conceive of yourself as a burden to others, and they conceive of you in the same way, it contributes to what's been called demoralization. And I think that the higher up in the class system you go, actually, the more demoralization there is. Because reaching a point where the feeling is that you don't want to be a burden to others assumes that you're getting vibrations that you are a burden to others. And I wrote in my book, Entrusting Doctors, an anecdote of a lawyer who wrote a letter to the New York Times saying that not only did he not want to think about whether he was a burden to others, but he didn't, and thus a candidate for medical assistance in dying, but he didn't want to think about that others were thinking about it, that the expectation that they were thinking about it would be harmful to him in a way that was demoralizing. And I think that there's a kind of necessity of what Freud would have called a repression, where you not only don't think about it, but you don't think that you're not thinking about it. It's so far removed from the way you live among others. But it's crept in more among the affluent than any other class in American society. So in Massachusetts, we had a referendum really led by some of the leadership of the New England Journal of Medicine, where a physician-assisted suicide was up for vote. And it was voted down. And you have to ask the question, well, who voted against it? And the answer was that portion of the population that still operated under the notion that this wasn't worth the time to really think about, and that it could have the unintended consequence that everyone would have to start thinking about it. Now they're trying to get it on a referendum again, and it may pass, because we've seen in the states, a number of states that have passed these laws. How do you develop cultural resistance to that? In the same way I was referring to Down syndrome. It can't be purely on the backs and responsibility of medical professionals, because they have work to do. I don't think I'm saying anything new about that. But what I am saying is that there appears to be opportunities in communicating more effectively about what kinds of unintended consequences there may be. Not that I'm going to argue that all people are going to be persuaded, but again, having the opportunity to show practices that are different than having to make that choice. So the rise of hospice in the United States is complicated by the fact that the government got involved in the hospice business rather directly by enabling people to die at home. But there's a lot of consternation about that, about whether dying people at home are cared for and attended to adequately. So there's a lot of work to do in that regard still. The collateral damage that these forces have had, certainly in the last number of years, and I gather in Canada, it's at the moment it's even more profound, is that when euthanasia is legalized, does having a conscientious objection to it mean that one is unprofessional? And I think that there, again, the idea of professionalism has to be wedded with some form of sensibility and understanding that is extra professional, that's not necessarily related to doing things in a purely competent manner. There are clearly competent ways to kill people. So I ask, what is a profession without the right to exercise conscience? And here's my answer. Leading by example. So for me, what I'm trying to do in the work that I'm doing now is to report on how practitioners are leading by example, how different cultural institutions like Jerome Lejeune Foundation are leading by example. And I consider this to be the missing ingredient in public reporting of what a vocation is. And I say here that it is manifest in those who lead by example, who are known to lead by example. It's not tied to only to an occupational role or professional duty. It is the continual enactment of conscience. I wrote an article in a journal called The American Interest 5 or 6 years ago on the film A Man for All Seasons. I don't know if you know that. The Henry VIII and Thomas More. It's not exactly what happened, but we don't know exactly what happened. There's a report of the trial, for example. But what I was interested in writing about it was the fact that, in a way, conscience had been hijacked, and that the resistance to certain kinds of social changes, to me, is a much more illustrative way to understand the enactment of conscience than arguing for changes in the law. So that's what I said earlier, the gap between law and morality, between the way in which we conceive of obligation and duty, that More was, of course, exemplary in that regard. And the film, at the time, probably didn't bring out so much questions about professional responsibility, because it was at a period when America was fighting in Vietnam. And so conscientious objection tended to refer to those who didn't want to go fight based on their religious convictions, and they went to Canada. And it was Jimmy Carter who brought them back in the 1970s. What's interesting to me is that to say that conscientious objection to euthanasia or abortion, as I discovered in my earlier work, to say that that is unprofessional is a distortion of conscientious objection. How we make that clearer is an important responsibility, I think, of those who want to have some impact on the culture. So, how do we identify exemplars of vocation, of thinking by leading by example? These are 3 books that I would recommend. James O'Connell's Stories from the Shadows, Reflections of a Street Doctor. He works in Boston at Boston Medical Center, has been ministering as a doctor to the homeless for quite a long time. And the book is a very interesting account of the kinds of things he does, of the way he leads by example. I can say more about that. David Loxterkamp spoke here a couple years ago, and he's written not only this book, but another book, and some interesting articles which I've assigned to my students for years. He's a bit like the country doctor that I illustrated, Ceriani, earlier. But what's interesting is to read his narrative, to understand the way he conceives of his obligations, again, is something that needs greater visibility. Abraham Nussbaum, who you probably should invite at some point, is a psychiatrist in Colorado. This book is probably the most recent one, The Finest Traditions of My Calling. Well worth seeing the way in which he sees the world and our responsibility of making it better known. So I say that such writers exemplify what has been called a reverence for life. And I'll finish with 3 quotes. The first is from a philosopher, Elizabeth Anscombe. Some of you may be familiar with her. Con natural knowledge, I'm not theologically sophisticated, but I know it comes from commentary of St. Thomas Aquinas. She's referring here to a sort of knowledge someone has who has a certain virtue, the capacity to recognize what action will accord with and what ones will be contrary to virtue. The person who has no meanness in him, but rather generosity, is liable to avoid or reject some course of action without difficulty, perceiving it to be ungenerous. And this is the last line I wanted to call your attention to. Or it simply won't occur to him as a possibility. The repressive mode. I know Freud's not a great hero anymore, but he said some very intelligent things. That idea that not only is it not in your consciousness, but it can't be there. It's simply unknowable. Can we get to an enactment of that other than unconsciously? I don't know. The last lines in my book on trusting doctors is taken from Paul Ramsey, who was a Presbyterian theologian at Princeton, who wrote these words: "Our children and our children's children will not even have been cognizant of the fact they have journeyed on into the setting sun of Western law and morality, not seeing the shadows. We may even be living between the evenings, a beautiful and, I believe, Jewish expression for twilight. That's the sum of it. And I want to update that with a wonderful book that I recommend to everyone by a writer, T.A. Kavanaugh, called Hippocrates' Oath and Asclepius' Snake. And he writes, caring for the ill involves one in deeply significant acts that merit invocation of that which one holds sacred. Simply put, medicine involves professing the oath's legacy. That's what his whole book's about. That the vows vary, however, indicates a lack of consensus concerning the specifics to which medical practice commits one. Apparently, there is no longer one medical creed. Rather, one finds diverse pledges. So I leave you with the question, what if there really are today two medical professions? One that is enacting actions at the beginning and the end of life that the other would never even consider. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Imber. It was very enlightening, your teaching to us, to me, about what's going on through the years, right? It's difficult sometimes when we are stuck in a moment to, to have the sense that there is something bigger, right, than us. My question to you was, in particular, when you spoke about the factors that declines trust. At one point on your slide, there was the practitioner control, right? And I am thinking about, I read lately some articles about the patient control. So now we are in the era, in a sense, in which we have given the patient, specifically in my job, which we are always in decision-making profile. I am a neonatologist, and we have opened the gates to, our unit to families. And obviously, the difficulty of communicating and taking decisions on the babies, right, come with conflicts, right? And now my fear is that when I started medical, I was a medical student, everybody talked to me about how important was the alliance with the patient. I wanted to have a comment from you, if you have read something or something that can help us to understand a little bit more this process. Now I see more that the patient is not an ally anymore. I mean, it's an ally only if you can control it, right? But it's becoming an enemy almost, because it can ask questions, it can sue you, and I see that coming to Canada more and more now. And so I think when we go and meet with them, we can, as professional and physician, we can be very naively open to, but it's a reality that is touching all of us, right? And I think, somebody before you spoke about fear, right? How fear blocks, and and I think this is part of the fear that sometimes I think my colleagues, or even in front of decision of life and death, which I live constantly, daily life in my unit, in my work, can jeopardize really this relationship with for me is with my patient, but mainly with the parents of the patients, right? But in other type of practice and medicine, how do you see it? How do you see it coming towards us?
I don't have a simple answer to that question, but I definitely understand the concern, because I think that the way in which the system, as I was describing it, has come to have a much greater impact on the choices that the individual practitioner can make. Again, I think that so much of this boils down to matters of conscience and the enactment of conscience with the full awareness of the possible consequences. And when I did my earlier studies of doctors, I guess there's a paradox built into that because, for instance, the way in which many the doctors that I interviewed thought about different issues was to figure out how to insulate themselves from controversy. But that's not happening anymore. That's the problem. It's a problem that I think right in this room, everyone's more acutely aware of the difficult situations, in particular people of faith have with a larger process of secularization. I didn't even use that word. It's another jargonistic way of describing a kind of emerging ethic that if you're not with us, you're against us. And again, my remedies are not easily accomplished, but I think that they're conceivable. That is, I think that changing the culture is something that has been primarily on the side, or the power of it has been on the side of secularization. But the counterforce is not the imposition of religious authority. It's the imposition of a well-understood conscience that shows us how we can do things differently. But it takes a certain bravery on the part of people to do that when the forces appear to be against them. And I've heard that dilemma here over the years. And just being able to articulate that it is a dilemma is a beginning of a consciousness that could have an impact on the culture more generally. I think that there's a lot of ways in which leading, what I call leading by example, has an impact on people because we live in powerfully anecdotal narrative times where storytelling comes to be a powerful way in which people are affected both intellectually and emotionally. And it's that feeling intellect that's why I had Kevorkian up there. I mean, I think that he illustrated how powerful the separation of feeling and intellect could be. We have to figure out ways to bring them much more closely together.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think it's important for us sometimes, as my colleague alluded to, that we be able to be meta-cognizant of the system of what's going on. We're in the front line doing the work. In our office, I work in a private practice, so I just see my patients. I don't attend, except for conferences like this. I don't attend committees and all kinds of things. So I devote 100% of my time to my patients. I like very much the idea of the leading example. I'll give you an example. apart from Grégoire, who said that he wants to change mentality by acting, by giving an example of having results for him means, well, if I set up solutions that work and that are pro-life, in other words, pro-life in the sense that are in the sense of having people live, because mental illness patients, if they're tied up somewhere, they don't get to contribute. And I've seen so many of those. Once they have been healed, and not cured, but healed, how much they can contribute. I mean, it's incredible. We had that lady, 36 years, tied up on a pile of dirt for 36 years. And when Grégoire went to the village, he was asked to pick a few people in the village that were tied up. And he said, well, I'll take those, but I want the lady there. He said, the chief of the village says, why would you? I mean, this is garbage. He says, I want that. I want that lady. I want it. He said, okay, if you want it, you take her, no problem. And she's been an example for the whole center. She was so much tied up that she was like this. But she had physiotherapy and massage, and she was able, and she was the light of the heart, and the joy of the center. I have an example we've done for alternatives, as you said, leading example, doing things that will give a solution, give an alternative. It's in the sense of abortion. We had here in Montreal with a priest a number of years ago, 15 years ago, who said, look, university students, they're going to abort, but let's say we have how do you say, une garderie? Kindergarten, yeah. We'll have a daycare. And we'll organize a daycare, and we'll take care, we'll have experts come in, doctors and nurses, and that was called cigogne, stork, I think in English, yeah. And it works. I mean, over the last 15 years, how many students would have aborted, but they haven't because they had the support. So these kinds of, but I agree with you, it does take a lot of courage from us, not only doctors but caretakers, because really I get my third child. Her name is Camille, and she's she's going to become nurse soon. Very beautiful person in all senses, in all meanings, but she, with respect to euthanasia, she has bought the secular ethics, and when I discuss with her, I seem like an old guy, like an ancient, this, I'm not in anymore. And this secular ethics seems to be setting the norm. And when you go against the norm, you're the bad guy, or you're the guy who doesn't understand. So, there's this thing we're caught into. I just wanted to say that comment.
I was going to say, with respect to abortion, my book from 1986 was reprinted in 2017 by another publisher. Now it's Routledge, I think. And I had a new introduction looking at the community that I studied 30 years before, and an epilogue. And in the epilogue, it's precisely the idea of setting an example, which we would call pro-life, that taking greater responsibility for the lives that we bring into the world, as a counterpoint to the feelings of necessity that a woman can't do that now. And again, the social class factors are so powerful. They don't get the attention that they deserve, because at the beginning of life as well, the whole idea of autonomy is so profound that when you see a counterexample, it almost seems astonishing. And I think that this dynamic is the one that I will be in until I go out of this world, but I think that my children will be largely in it as well for quite a long time, which is all the more reason to fight it.
One last question.
Yes, I almost decided not to say anything because it's a very complex question and for me. So I was thinking, you mentioned that the professions tended before to be less political, and that now, now more and more we see professions being politicized. So for me, that would imply that, for me, the fact of resisting a decision which has been made on a more of a wider social scale, for me, that is the equivalent of, for example, a police officer not enforcing a law because he personally disagrees with it. So for me, which for me is a profoundly political gesture. My question is it really, and when we define the profession, I'm not saying I'm for or against assisted dying. I don't really have an opinion on it. I haven't come to an opinion yet. But is it the place? And we also talked about trust. So I'm a patient representative, as you've seen. And for me, perhaps also the question of trust. I trust that, for example, my physician will enact acts which are considered socially as medical acts, even if he might personally disagree with them. Such as abortion, for example, which in Canada was medicalized very quickly. I can't remember the name of the gentleman, I think it was from the East Coast, who said, well, if I don't do it, they're going to do it at home. And so therefore it immediately became a medical act very quickly here. Whereas in the States, it's still a very big debate. Here it's much less of a debate now. And then you do it or you don't. But however, when I go to my physician, I expect that person to do what has been socially accepted as a medical intervention, no matter what his beliefs are. It's like, for example, a Muslim, I think certain faiths will not want to be woman, man, etc. So what would you have to say about that?
So one of the things that I've been interested in for the last dozen years or so is the interface of religious tradition and medical practice. Because if, for instance, you think about again, I'm thinking about this sociologically, so I'm referring to religious traditions in what Max Weber would call an ideal typical way. You take Orthodox Jewish medical ethics. The first major statements on it were from the chief rabbi in England, Manuel Jakubowicz. There you have prescriptions and opinions and ideas that are intended to apply to that community. It's not making a civil set of arguments per se. The Catholic tradition is different in so far as there's been historically in the United States much more of an interface that, say, resistance to euthanasia or to abortion 30 or 40 years ago, or to birth control for that matter in the 1930s. There was an application of what might be thought of as a more universalistic way of thinking about the relationship between church and state, so much so that in the American case, even when John F. Kennedy was running for president, there was anxieties raised that he would be taking orders from the Pope. So that kind of interface, though, in this period of time, I would argue is very different, that some religious traditions are basically moralizing to their own. I think that the power that I've seen in the Catholic tradition is not one of proselytizing. It has really very little to do with that, even historically, despite the paranoia that it created in America in the 19th century and right up to Kennedy's election. But he did get elected, so that's important. The point I'm trying to make is that I think that 500 years of casuistry is something that you should be paying attention to, because it means that there have been a lot of thought put to the way in which to think about these issues and the way in which we can estimate unintended consequences for not thinking about them. And this has become, for me at least, I got interested in the question of abortion. I wrote this in the reprinting of my book. I was on a train. I was studying at the London School of Economics, and I was on a train from London to Bath because a graduate student that I become friendly with invited me out to see the Roman baths and spend the day. And there I had the International Herald Tribune, and in a very little spot, it was January maybe 24th or 5th, 1973, was a report on the Supreme Court's cases on Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton. Most people don't even know the second case. But Roe versus Wade suddenly occurred to me in reading it that it would be the end in America of what we called shotgun weddings, right? That a girl got pregnant and had to have a child. And I didn't know much about illegal abortion at that time. All I was thinking of was that it was going to have a dramatic effect on the normative structure and the relationship between girls and boys, men and women. The aftermath that we've been living with ever since in the United States, that it forced us to have a different set of conversations with the way in which the court eliminated and turned an action into a right. And I think that, to me, it represents the growing divide between what is legal and what becomes viewed as moral in a matter of conscience. And we have to acknowledge that it seems unlikely in the near term that we're going to bring those two things closer together, except in terms of aligning law with secular morality. And that's why when I point out things like commodification and corporatization, all those phenomena that sociologists had historically been saying were critical of the medical profession, I don't think that was actually right. It was critical of processes, systemic processes that were overwhelming the way in which individual practitioners thought about their responsibilities and duties. So, as I said, this is no simple challenge for any of us, but there has to be ways of making it more explicit so that people understand what the stakes are. Yes, of course, there's controversy had been going on ever since I did my empirical study in the 1970s about what the obligation of a practitioner is to refer a patient for a procedure that they wouldn't do themselves. When I first wrote about it, they took care of it by referring to the clinics. Euthanasia has made it, again, a very complicated process. But I do think that we have to be able to say that professionalization is not the same as what the law permits. That the law is going to permit more than maybe a good number of people are going to resist, regardless of what the system looks like. And that's where we're at. I don't know if that even
Yeah, thanks.
remotely gets to it. But
Well, yeah, we won't be. Let's talk later.
okay.
Yeah, precisely. On that note, thank you very much, Professor Imber.